Welcome to Unintended Consequences, Episode 42. It's June 27th, 2026. Today's case study, a story of good intentions and surprising results. St. Louis built Pruitt-Igoe in 1954 as a model of clean, modern public housing for working families, and dynamited the first buildings on national television in 1972. On March 21st, 1972, a crowd gathered on the edge of the Pruitt-Igoe site in St. Louis as a series of controlled explosions brought down the first of the 33 11-story towers. The buildings had opened only 18 years earlier to national praise as a forward-looking answer to slum clearance. They were designed to give low-income residents light, air, and dignity through generous windows, cross-ventilation in the cruciform layouts, and surrounding lawns that replaced crowded streets. Instead, they became places where maintenance collapsed, crime rose, and most residents left as soon as they could because the same features that looked efficient on the drawing board interacted with later funding rules and shifting tenant incomes in ways no one had modeled in advance. The project grew out of the Housing Act of 1949, which committed federal funds to clear blighted areas and replace them with decent housing. In St. Louis, city officials and the local housing authority selected a 57-acre site on the near north side that had been labeled one of the worst slums in the country. Architect Minoru Yamasaki, working with the firm Lineweber, Yamasaki, and Helmuth, produced a plan of 33 cruciform towers set in open green space, drawing on Le Corbusier's ideas of towers in a park. The design promised indoor plumbing, central heating, and private apartments for roughly 2,870 families who had been living in tenements without those basics. At the time, many planners and elected officials viewed high-rise public housing as both humane and efficient because it used less land than low-rise replacements and could be built quickly with federal subsidies. The first residents moved in during 1954 and 1955. And early occupancy rates were high. Construction began in 1951, and the complex was completed by 1955 at a cost of about $36 million. The St. Louis Housing Authority set income limits that initially favored working families, and the first tenants included postal workers, teachers, and factory employees. Local newspapers ran photographs of children playing on new playgrounds and families furnishing bright apartments. Within a few years, however, the Housing Authority shifted its admissions policy under federal pressure to serve the poorest applicants, and the proportion of households on welfare rose sharply. Maintenance budgets remained tied to rent collections, which fell as tenant incomes declined. By 1960, the complex was already reporting vacancies in some buildings, and the city began to notice problems with elevators and trash chutes that had been designed for lighter use, because the original engineering assumptions had counted on steady occupancy by families whose rents would cover routine upkeep. The combination of concentrated poverty, reduced maintenance funding, and design features that made informal supervision difficult produced a rapid downward spiral. Because rents were calculated as a percentage of income, the authority had little revenue to pay for repairs once higher-earning tenants left for suburban jobs or private housing. A family earning twice as much paid twice the rent, so every departure of a working household removed a larger share of the operating budget than the arrival of a lower-income household could replace. Federal public housing rules at the time discouraged mixed-income occupancy, so the buildings increasingly housed only the poorest families, many of them headed by single mothers after the loss of manufacturing jobs in North St. Louis. The open galleries and stair towers that had been meant to foster community instead became difficult to police. Crime reports from the St. Louis Police Department show rising rates of theft and vandalism through the mid-1960s. White flight and highway construction further isolated the site, cutting it off from remaining job centers. By 1969, the complex was more than 60% vacant, and remaining residents described long waits for broken elevators and uncollected garbage. The city's decision to stop investing in repairs once vacancy rates climbed created a feedback loop. Each departure reduced revenue, which justified further cuts, which prompted more departures, Second order effects included the concentration of social services inside the towers and the stigma that made it harder for residents to find work or credit elsewhere in the city. After several years of debate, the Department of Housing and Urban Development approved demolition in 1972. The televised implosions became a symbol for critics of modernist planning, though many of the underlying policy constraints on funding and tenant selection remained in place. Later federal programs, such as Hope 011, tried to replace high-rise projects with lower-density, mixed-income developments. Yet those efforts also faced funding shortfalls and siting conflicts. Today, the former Pruitt-Igoe land holds a small number of scattered public housing units, a school, and vacant parcels. The city has never rebuilt at the original density. The episode did not end large-scale public housing, but it did shift federal policy toward vouchers and scattered site approaches in many cities. When operating budgets depend directly on tenant incomes, any policy that concentrates the poorest households risks starving the very buildings meant to serve them. Design choices interact with funding rules and demographic patterns, so changes in one area can amplify problems in others. Planners today still face the same tension between targeting aid precisely and maintaining the revenue base that keeps housing viable. How might current efforts to add deeply affordable units to new market rate buildings avoid repeating that revenue trap? And that's where today's story leaves us. If it changed how you see one everyday decision, that's the whole point. Pass it along to someone who'd appreciate it, and we'll be back tomorrow with another case. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NARA Network. Links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. Fascinating Frontiers, the most fascinating news from space and science. Find every show free at naranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.